Injury and the risk of death are constant companions of those who explore the worlds of D&D. The thrust of a goblin's sword, a well-placed assassin's arrow, or the blast of flames from a wizard's fireball spell all have the potential to damage, or even kill, the hardiest of adventurers and monsters. On today's D&D Academy, we're covering damage and healing in Dungeons & Dragons. Welcome back. I'm Paul, the Dungeon Master here at House of Crit, and to kick off this tutorial, we need to first talk about hit points. Hit points represent a combination of physical and mental durability, the will to live, and luck. Creatures with more hit points are more difficult to kill. Those with fewer hit points are more fragile. There are three aspects to hit points, and those are hit point maximum, current hit points, and temporary hit points. A creature's hit point maximum is the total amount of hit points a creature has. A creature can never have more hit points than its hit point maximum. A creature's current hit points can be any number from the creature's hit point maximum down to 0. This number changes frequently as the creature takes damage or receives healing. Whenever a creature takes damage, that damage is subtracted from its hit points. The loss of hit points has no actual effect on the creature's capabilities until the creature drops to 0 hit points. Temporary hit points are a special type of hit points that can be gained from special abilities and spells. They are separate from a creature's actual hit points. In fact, temporary hit points aren't actually hit points. They are a buffer against damage, a pool of hit points that protect you from injury. We'll cover them in more detail later in this episode when we talk about healing. Let's now talk about damage. Damage occurs after an attack is successful on a target, or the target fails a saving throw against a damaging spell or effect. Each weapon, spell, and monster ability specifies the damage it deals. You roll the damage die or dice, add any modifiers, and apply the damage to your target. Magic weapons, special abilities, and other factors can grant a bonus to damage. When attacking with a weapon, you add your ability modifier, the same modifier used for the attack roll, to the damage. A spell tells you which dice to roll for damage and whether to add any modifiers. If a spell or other effect deals damage to more than one target at the same time, roll the damage once for all of them. For example, when a wizard casts Fireball, the spell's damage is rolled once for all the creatures caught in the blast. Let's go over an example of this. On their turn, the barbarian attacks a goblin with their great axe. First, they make their attack roll. They roll a d20 and add their proficiency bonus and strength modifier to the roll. They have a proficiency bonus of +2, and their strength modifier is +3. They roll a 14, adding the +2 and +3, giving them a total of 19. This is more than the goblin's AC of 15, so the attack hits. Now they get to roll damage. Their great axe does 1d12 slashing damage, so they then roll a d12 and add their strength modifier of +3 to this roll. They roll an 8, add the +3, and get a total of 11. So the DM narrates how they cleave into the goblin, dealing it 11 points of damage. But what if they rolled a natural 20 on their attack roll? That would be a critical hit. Critical hits, which we talked about in our dice rolls video, always hit regardless of any bonuses and double the damage dice of the attack. Since our barbarian's great axe normally deals 1d12 damage, a critical hit means they deal 2d12 damage instead. They then add the modifier as normal to this roll. Critical hits double all the dice of a damage roll, so any damage dice that would be added from spells and abilities get doubled as well. Different attacks, damaging spells, and other harmful effects deal different types of damage. There are 13 different types of damage in D&D, and they are acid, bludgeoning, cold, fire, force, lightning, necrotic, piercing, poison, psychic, radiant, slashing, and thunder. Damage types have no rules of their own, but other rules, such as damage resistance and vulnerability, rely on the types. Some creatures and objects are exceedingly difficult or unusually easy to hurt with certain types of damage. If a creature or an object has resistance to a damage type, damage of that type is halved against it. If a creature or an object has vulnerability to a damage type, damage of that type is doubled against it. Now, let's go over healing. Unless it results in death, damage isn't permanent. Rest can restore a creature's hit points, which we'll cover in our upcoming resting video, and magical methods such as a cure wounds spell or a potion of healing can remove damage in an instant. When a creature receives healing of any kind, hit points regained are added to its current hit points. Again, a creature's hit points can't exceed its hit point maximum, so any hit points regained in excess of this number are unfortunately lost. As an example, the druid grants a ranger 8 hit points of healing. The ranger has 14 current hit points and has a hit point maximum of 20. The ranger regains only 6 hit points from the druid, not 8, so as to not go over their hit point maximum. A creature that has died can't regain hit points until magic, such as the Revivify spell, has restored it to life. Earlier, I mentioned that some spells and special abilities confer temporary hit points to a creature. When you have temporary hit points and take damage, the temporary hit points are lost first, and any leftover damage carries over to your normal hit points. As an example, if you have 5 temporary hit points and take 7 points of damage, you lose the temporary hit points and then take 2 points of damage. Because temporary hit points are separate from your actual hit points, they can exceed your hit point maximum. A character can therefore be at full hit points and receive temporary hit points. Healing can't restore temporary hit points, and they cannot be added together. If you have temporary hit points and receive more of them, you decide whether to keep the ones you currently have or gain the new ones. As an example, if a spell grants you 12 temporary hit points when you already have 10, you can have 12 or 10, not 22. If you have 0 hit points, receiving temporary hit points does not restore you to consciousness or stabilize you. They can still absorb damage directed at you while you're in that state, but only true healing can save you. Unless a feature that grants you temporary hit points has a duration, they last until you've depleted them or you finish a long rest. And now to finish up our conversation about damage and healing, let's talk about death. Unlike video games or board games, death in D&D is permanent and is something you do not come back from, except through powerful magic, and even then, there's no guarantee. There are 2 ways a creature can die in D&D: instant death or failing 3 death saving throws. Instant death is pretty rare past the first few levels of the game. When damage reduces you to 0 hit points, and there is damage remaining, you die if the remaining damage equals or exceeds your hit point maximum. For example, a cleric with a maximum of 12 hit points currently has 6 hit points. If they take 18 damage from an attack, they are reduced to 0 hit points, but 12 damage remains. Because the remaining damage equals their hit point maximum, the cleric dies immediately. If damage reduces you to 0 hit points, but fails to kill you outright, you fall unconscious and remain at 0 hit points. This unconsciousness ends if you regain any hit points. Whenever you start your turn with 0 hit points, you must make a special saving throw called a death saving throw. This is to determine whether you creep closer to death or hang on to life. Unlike other saving throws, this one isn't tied to any ability score. You are now purely in the hands of fate, aided only by spells and features that improve your chances of succeeding on a saving throw. Normally, you just roll a d20 without any modifiers. If the roll is 10 or higher, you succeed. Otherwise, you fail. A success or failure has no effect by itself. On your 3rd success, you become stable. On your 3rd failure, you die. The successes and failures do not need to be consecutive. You only have to keep track of both until you collect 3 of a kind. The number of both is reset to 0 when you regain any hit points or become stable. There are some special conditions that occur with death saving throws. When you make a death saving throw and roll a 1 on the d20, it counts as 2 failures. But if you roll a 20 on the d20, you regain 1 hit point and are no longer unconscious. Something to keep in mind, however, is that if you take any damage when you have 0 hit points, you suffer a death saving throw failure. If the damage is from a critical hit, you suffer 2 failures instead. Additionally, If the damage equals or exceeds your hit point maximum, you suffer instant death. An important point to note here, which is not laid out well at all in the player's handbook, is that any attack against an unconscious target has advantage, and any attack that hits the unconscious creature is a critical hit if the attacker is within 5 feet of it. What this means is that any attack against an unconscious creature that is 5 feet away has advantage, is a critical hit if the attack is successful, and the creature automatically loses 2 death saving throws. If this is one of the PCs, this is extremely bad. One other thing to note about death saving throws is that while all PCs make them, monsters can make them as well. This is at the DM's discretion, however. Typically, when a monster reaches 0 hit points, the DM rules that it dies outright, but this is not always the case. Mighty villains and special non-player characters are common exceptions. The DM might have them merely fall unconscious and follow the same rules as player characters. The best way to save a creature with 0 hit points is to heal it. If healing is unavailable, the creature can at least be stabilized so that it isn't killed by failed death saving throws. You can use your action in combat to administer first aid to an unconscious creature and attempt to stabilize it, which requires a successful DC 10 Wisdom Medicine check. A stable creature doesn't make death saving throws, even though it has 0 hit points, but it does remain unconscious. The creature stops being stable and must start making death saving throws again if it takes any damage. A stable creature that isn't healed regains 1 hit point after 1d4 hours. I think that pretty much covers everything about damage and healing and death. We're nearly done discussing combat in D&D, so next week we'll finish going over the special combat rules, covering all the odd aspects of combat that don't occur in every battle but are still important. Thank you again for joining me, and if this video helped you out, consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons down below, and possibly sharing these videos with your gaming groups. I'll be back next Wednesday with another D&D Academy video, so I'll see you soon.